Hello everyone! Anduin Wrynn has been giving some amazing art within Hearthstone, which got the fans quite going. And the lad, he's been through quite a lot, going from this,
Greetings, citizen.
all the way to this.
I only hope my friends will remember me as I was.
So let's sit down and talk about his story. A story that sadly begins in tragedy, losing his mother Tiffin Wrynn at a very early age. The Stonemasons Guild at the time, they worked really hard at rebuilding after the Orcish horde had brought death and destruction. But when it was time to pay, the nobles refused. Manipulation by the Black Dragon Onyxia, disguised as Lady Katrana Prestor, made sure of that, to which riots spread through the streets. These workers were very unhappy and they were going to be heard. The queen was killed while she was attempting to calm down the rioting stonemasons, which left Anduin alone in the care of his grieving father. Well, not entirely alone, I suppose. He is royalty after all. There were plenty of people to still take care of him. Onyxia was also still hanging out with them, nobody having a clue what she was really all about. Her next plan for messing things up within the human kingdom, that was to have Varian kidnapped. The King of Stormwind was invited over to Theramore for a meeting to discuss potential peace with the leader of the new horde, with Thrall. The history between humans and orcs isn't exactly a peaceful one. But Anduin was able to convince his father to go to Theramore and Lady Jaina Proudmoore, to at the very least hear what they had to say. En route they took him, brought over to Onyxia, where she magically split the king in two. She was gonna have one weak side of him that was gonna go back to the city, a part that she could easily manipulate and control. The other part, the strong-willed side of him, she'd simply kill off, but that's where things didn't exactly work out. That part of Varian managed to escape, while the other eventually returned home to be used as a puppet by Onyxia. Say that you happen to check out the throne room in Classic, you actually see Anduin in charge, asking about his father.
Hi there. Have you heard any news of my father?
The boy was clever enough to realize that something wasn't quite right when his father did return. He discussed this with Bolvar Fordragon, who agreed with the prince, had the situation investigated. The love for his child weakened the hold that Onyxia had over Varian, and eventually they uncovered her true identity. The two Varians wanted to bring her to swift justice, but Lady Prestor wasn't gonna go out without a fight. She kidnapped the prince, brought him back to her lair, luring Varian and the others to their demise. She would wipe them all out and rule over Stormwind as the Lady Prestor. But the raid team was simply too strong. During the battle, she even accidentally merged the Varians back together, to which the Black Dragon was slain and Anduin was saved. Heroic tales would be taken back home, and finally they had their chance for that peace meeting. As I said before, relations between humans and orcs, the Alliance and the Horde, they're rocky at best. There's a lot of bad blood and bad history there, but it's our Anduin who makes the first move, puts down his weapon and speaks towards peace. When Garrosh scuffed at these negotiations, finding them fit only for merchants, while they had the strength to take what they wanted, Anduin pointed out that words would lead them to much greater profits. Why waste your warriors and resource in battle? A wise, young prince, a diplomat amongst them, yet not even he was able to bring this meeting to a peaceful end. This is Warcraft, after all. Outside forces will always seek to corrupt and manipulate. The meeting ended in failure, with both sides returning home to focus on the threats of the Lich King.
Remember, our line has always ruled with wisdom and strength.
Arthas Menethil had woken up and was ready to unleash his undead masses upon the world. Over the years, many have pointed out the many similarities between Arthas and Anduin, even going as far as to wonder if Arthas is not actually his daddy. Now, interesting as that might be, it doesn't exactly work with the story we have right now. Either way, Wrath the Lich King played out. The Horde and Alliance, not exactly playing nice with each other, but they still got the job done. Arthas was ultimately slain, to which Bolvar Fordragon took up the charge for being the jailer of the damned. This man had been there for Anduin and the kingdom when his father was unable. A hero and legend amongst his people, so while he asked Tyrion to keep his fate a secret, Fordring didn't exactly do a great job at it. Word spread around, and it would be many years until Anduin would even get close to Bolvar again.
Resist him! Do not let the jailer win!
At age 13 and a half, it's safe to say that our young Anduin already had his fair share of adventure and tragedy, but this was just the start. Another similarity with Arthas is that at a young age, Anduin can't really wield a weapon, not like his father can. He's alright with a bow, he even picked up the throwing dagger skill from Valera Sanguinar, but wielding a blade or holding his own in a fight isn't part of him quite yet. That bit, and not having seen a whole lot of the world yet, and the relations with his hot-headed father being quite rocky, it made Varian decide to send the prince over to the dwarves in Ironforge. This idea actually excited Anduin. The dwarves' courage and tenacity, it was something that he greatly admired. And while his focus was more drawn to the Explorers League, while Varian's was more drawn to getting some training going, both of them would be surprised when Anduin's focus was actually drawn to the light. He was born a prince, not a priest, and no doubt that his destiny was gonna include more war, more violence, and would demand of him politicking and maneuvering. But when he was in the Hall of Mysteries, discussing the ways of the light with High Priest Rohan, he did not think of such things. His mind was dreaming of a world where anyone could walk into any city and be welcomed there with open arms. An idealist with a very different mindset of his father, in a world that so often proved the opposite.
And all will burn beneath the shadow of my wings.
This visit took place just before the Cataclysm expansion, the time in which Deathwing broke out of the world and we saw it quite changed. Not just the world itself, the factions also had quite a few changes. While he was here in Ironforge, Magni Bronzebeard decided to use an ancient ritual to communicate with the lands. Figure out why the elements were in such an uproar, what the heck was going on. But instead of just communicating with the lands, Magni became part of it, turned into a crystal, which left the dwarves without a leader, and the door wide open for his daughter Moira to walk into their city. Not exactly welcomed with open arms though. Might have something to do with Moira locking them down, taking everybody hostage. She laid claim to the crown by force, even though it was her right. But what she didn't know was that our Prince Anduin had been gifted a Hearthstone by his auntie Jaina. This way, he could visit her at Fedamore whenever he liked. Or, in this case, he could escape the city, inform them on what was going on. His hot-headed father immediately drew up battle plans, but Anduin thought that it shouldn't just be about taking Moira's life. The daughter of the king might have gone about it the wrong way, but that didn't mean that she had no claim. Taking her out, it would just mean a lot of people were going to die, and the succession would be thrown into confusion. Instead of coming together as a people, the dwarves were going to find themselves in the midst of another civil war. Being the voice of reason, as he so often was, even at his young age, he was able to convince his father of this truth, calming down the strong-willed Logash side of him, and think beyond what he just wanted. Think about what was best for all of the dwarves. Ultimately, they decided that a council would rule them from now on, representing the different dwarven clans, and giving Moira that opportunity she needed to prove that she was worthy, that she could be better, just like Varian had to be better.
I am Varian, but I am also Logash.
But that road had changed for his father. It was not gonna come easy. Ever since being split apart by Onyxia, Varian had to deal with those two sides of him. The rage inside of him coming to the surface, lashing out, which was a great benefit on the battlefield, not so much though when it comes to politics or his loved ones. A rift was growing between father and son, one that became a chasm when a meeting was called to discuss letting the Gilneans back into the Alliance. Most of the prominent leaders, they gathered within Darnassus. Under the guidance of Truanda and Malfurion, things seemed to be going rather nicely. That is, until Varian spoke out. He had not forgotten nor forgiven that Gan and his people had abandoned the Alliance in their hour of need. He had no intention of letting them back in, not even after Malfurion tried to make him see reason. And that was enough for the prince. He realized that if a 10,000-year-old elf couldn't convince his father to see reason, to stop living in the past and think about the greater good of their people, then surely he himself had no chance of succeeding. In the meantime, he'd also spoken with Velen the Prophet, the leader of the Draenei with a great affinity to the light. He could sense something special about Anduin. The light was extremely strong within. A destiny, perhaps. And Anduin has made up his mind and decides to join Velen and the Draenei for a while to learn more about the lights and its potential path. The boy turned to leave from his father, and something snapped in Varian. He saw his beloved Tiffin again, with their infant son snuggled in her arms. Tiffin faded away, leaving only the child, and the child began to fade away. Varian could not let that happen. Without thinking, he lunged forward, snaring Anduin's arm, crushing it in overwhelming fear. The madness soon left him, but the damage was already done. The hands that had strangled more than one foe, they now injured his very own blood, purely out of fear for losing him. While Varian would go on struggling with that inner rage inside, eventually mastering it with the aid of Gen and the Worgen. He would then go on, leading them to a great victory against Garrosh and the Hordes, even accepting them back into the Alliance, becoming the grand leader of them all. But Anduin's journey that had him follow Velen back to the Exeter, the Prophet did warn him that maybe he wanted to reconsider this choice. The path of the light is not a simple one after all, not even for one gifted as he was. But leaving the prince behind was not an option. He'd simply follow on his own accord. So while healing the injury caused by his father, the Prophet agreed. The pain in Anduin's arm quickly receded, becoming little more than a memory in but the blink of an eye. And as that happened, Anduin felt a stirring in his heart. Emotions arose, feelings of love and forgiveness. Along with those feelings, an image formed. One not of memory, but rather imagination. Anduin only knew his mother from pictures, and so the vision he had of her was one formed throughout his young life. In that vision, she was glorious, comforting. "You love her very much, your mother," Velen murmured. He did not bother to explain how he knew what Anduin was thinking. Velen was the Prophet after all. "She died when I was a baby, but all I've seen and heard from my father and others of the court makes me feel I know her and love her." The Draenei nodded. "You love your father much also?" Anduin swallowed, recalling the pain and constant frustration with the king, but also all that Varian had sought to do for him. "Of course, whatever our disagreements." Velen lowered his palm. The light faded from both his hand and the prince. The emotions faded too, though they never completely vanished. "And that is in great part why the light touches you so deep." The Prophet smiled slightly. "Very well, Anduin. We leave come sunlight."
We must unite against the Legion.
The cataclysm struck the world hard, and refugees from all over, they found a way to the Exeter as well. A call echoed throughout Kalimdor. The Prophet holds Azurmis safe. The Prophet foresaw the cataclysm and will make everything right. Our prince spent his time amongst the refugees, healing as he could, encouraging faith in the eternal light. But he could not help but drop a simple yet difficult question at Velen's feet. Why had the Prophet not warned them all? Why would a Prophet not warn of calamity? He had foreseen its coming, but the problem was that Velen's mind was a bit occupied. It was more focused on their great path, their great war against the Burning Legion, focused on the future rather than the here and now. But when the refugees started to panic, started to strike out at their hosts, and the Draenei struck them back, Anduin asked him, "What does your war matter to those fighting outside?" "Have I lost myself so much?" Velen wondered. "I must be taught by a mortal child." And then the answer came from the depths of his soul. The light's lessons are a boon, no matter their origin, no matter how ancient you might be. With an open mind and open heart, you can still learn. Outside, he cleaned up the mess, healed the wounded, proclaimed that the Draenei were going to stay. They were going to stay and help Azeroth in the great hour of need. And Velen was learning as much from Anduin as Anduin did in turn. "You will be a powerful priest someday, Prince Anduin, and a wise king." Anduin wished only that his father could hear those words. For his part, Anduin regretted their falling out. His father insisted on treating him like a child. When people like the prophets, Magni and others, they clearly saw him differently. Now at his age, Varian had already mastered the sword, was ready to meet the Alliance enemies in battle, but is the only measure of a man how early he kills? Anduin was not like Varian, not a warrior forged, but that didn't make him weak. Quite the opposite, as their time apart made Varian realize. The rift between father and son, it was going to need some healing, and on Remembrance Day, Anduin returned to the city. It was Archbishop Benedictus that tricked him into meeting his father at their mother's grave. They finally had their heart-to-heart, and Varian told him, "I stand rigid and inflexible against the storm, but you feel the wind. You bend with it and make it your own, and thus become unbreakable. Varian turned to Tiffin's memorial. Your mother had those same qualities. She had perfected the art of gentle persuasion, and her love moved the world. The prince stared at his mother's final resting place, trying to control fresh tears that flowed. Varian found himself saying things without thoughts, not as the King of Stormwind, but simply as a father to a son. It is good that you can cry over her, Anduin. I never had that strength. They both stood for a few moments, looking at the grave of the person whose mutual love was their deepest connection, even deeper than blood. I miss her, Anduin finally said. I know I was just a baby, but I can still feel her. And that is why you will be the greatest of the Wrynn kings, Varian said, patting his son's back. He wished the moment could have lost forever, but knew it could not. Looking up, he scanned his surroundings. So tell me, from what direction do you think the ambush will come? An ambush set up by the Twilight Hammer and Archbishop Benedictus, although his turn into the dark side was not quite known at this point. The two Wrynn kings, they fought together like a perfect team, Varian unleashing his low-gush, agile and strength, while Anduin supported him with the bow and the power of the light. They were winning the battle, until their enemy managed to summon in the biggest draconids they had ever seen. Father and son, with their backs against the walls, they tried to bring the beast down, but it was simply too much. Varian was severely wounded, believing this to be the end, pleading with Anduin to flee as the world around him turned dark, but his son wasn't about to leave his side. Kneeling next to Varian, praying and holding his ground against the menacing draconids, the king struggled for consciousness and slowly realized that it was his son, the prince's arms raised high, his shouts and prayers protecting his father and keeping the creature back. Anduin stood up now and opened his arms wide to the sky. A golden nova of holy energy forced the monster to retreat as the prince advanced, strong and fearless, like a king. As Anduin shouted the power words, barrier, the graveyard seemed to blur and shimmer around the king and prince. The draconic was confused now, and he swung his axe at the prince, but the mighty weapon harmlessly glanced off with a heavenly ring. Varian watched in wonder as Anduin persevered. The draconids circled, preparing to attack, and Anduin's only weapon was his faith. Varian tried to reach for his sword, but it was too far away. He fell back, gasping in pain, could barely breathe, much less move. Anduin, though, stood like a rock, courageous and resolute, even as the draconic prepared one final charge. Varian rolled over, despite the searing pain, and tried to get up. He had to do something. And suddenly, he felt a heavy shard of the Black Dragon's armor in his belt. The king struggled to reach it, finally pulling the razor-sharp spike free. With it, he managed to end the beast, as his son had dispelled the magic that had been protecting it. The wounds that his father suffered were severe though, and Varian thought that he would follow the fate of their bloodline, the fate of all the Wrynns. Anduin would watch his father die, just like Varian had seen his own. But the prince refused. This would not be their fate. Anduin screamed into the sky, and the clouds seemed to part in sympathy. The others that had found him by now, they watched in awe as the prince closed his eyes and slowly began to chant. At first, it was a soft and gentle sound, but as his voice rose in crescendo, it became a beautiful and powerful song. As the words came, his hands began to glow with light, faint at first, then brighter and brighter, until it was competing even with the setting sun, bathing the entire cemetery in the shadowless light of midday. The song reached a fever pitch, and the young priest lifted his eyes and voice to the heavens, calling to the very heart of the cosmos for a source of divine power. Suddenly, liquid rays brighter than 1,000 suns burst from Anduin's fingertips, penetrating the king's body and painting everything in a brilliant yellow glow. The guards gasped and stepped back, shielded their eyes as Varian's entire being was rocked by an influx of pure light. And at the center of it all was Anduin, holding his father close, while a vortex of infinite beauty danced between them. Then, in sharp contrast to the intense swirling energy billowing all around, the prince began to speak with a melodious and gentle voice as he carefully laid his hands on the immobile king's forehead and quietly, peacefully began to pray. While this moment is described in a way that could be seen as like a lay on hands or a very powerful heal. Considering the things that we get to see Anduin do later on, this might very well be one of the rare occasions in the lore where they pull out a full-blown resurrection. What we can easily pull off in the game due to game mechanics, it is rather rare within the story, but Anduin does seem to pull it off. Together, father and son, they step through the cataclysm, the rift between them being healed, with a greater understanding for one another, a foundation that's based upon love, something that Anduin believes will outlast even truth, honor, and duty. Varian can see now that his son is growing up, and while he desperately wants to protect him from the dangers of the world, he will also have to let him go, become his own person. That story, and so much more, we'll get back to next week. So for now, thank you very much for watching, everyone. Subscribe if you like my videos, leave a like if you enjoyed this one, and until next time, see ya!